The overhead lights hummed their fluorescent song at 2 in the morning, and Hannah Clarke moved through Sacred Heart's third-floor corridor like she'd been designed for the hours when the sun wouldn't dare show its face. 3 years. 1,095 nights of 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., pushing a medication cart that squeaked the same apologetic squeak every time she turned a corner, her badge hanging from a breakaway lanyard that caught the light every few steps but never held her name long enough for anyone to read it. She was competent. Invisible. Exactly what she needed to be. The reconstructed shoulder didn't show under the hospital blue scrubs. The physical therapy had been thorough enough that most people wouldn't notice the way she favored her left side when reaching overhead, the subtle compensation in her gait, the fact that she never raised her right arm above shoulder height without a 3-second pause first. The pain wasn't sharp anymore. It was information. Data. Something her body kept insisting on, and she kept listening to, the way you listen to a radio broadcast from a foreign country, present but separate. 3 surgeries. 18 months of reconstruction. A shoulder joint that would never throw a baseball again. The army had called it a medical discharge. Hannah called it mercy, though she wouldn't have said that out loud. She didn't say things out loud anymore. The patch was inside the lining of her scrub jacket, sewn with surgical precision into a place where the seam would only show if someone took the jacket apart completely. It was faded, the color had been washed out somewhere between Sangin and the airfield, somewhere between the moment a shaped charge turned her world from sound to silence to sound again, somewhere between who she used to be and who she had become. 75th Regiment. The embroidered lettering had nearly disappeared, the green faded to something that looked like old money, like institutional walls, like the kind of history that belonged to shadows. She touched it sometimes, her fingers tracing the outline through the fabric while she sat alone in the hospital break room at 3 a.m., holding a coffee she'd reheated twice and didn't really want, pressing her palm flat against her ribs where the patch sat like a heartbeat she kept trying to hide from herself. No one asked about the gap in her resume. 7 years between her last entry, an unremarkable stint at a clinic in Virginia Beach, and her hire date at Sacred Heart. The human resources woman had simply noted it as a leave of absence, medical in nature, and moved on. The background check had come back clean because the background check only looked at the things that were supposed to be recorded. It didn't look for calluses in the shape of rifle slings, or the way certain sounds made her eyes snap open in the dark, or the fact that she could clear a room in under 6 seconds without anyone ever knowing she was doing it. A nurse is a nurse is a nurse. The third shift offered anonymity like a gift. The dying don't ask questions. The sleeping don't keep track. The barely holding on don't remember your name. The vital signs came back steady on room 307, blood pressure 128/73, heart rate in the 80s, oxygen saturation 96% on 2 liters nasal cannula. Hannah checked them twice, her fingers moving with the kind of efficiency that came from muscle memory pushing through caution, from a time when vital signs had to be read by flashlight in darkness and reported by radio across distances that measured in kilometers and enemy contact zones. She adjusted the nasal cannula without waking the elderly man breathing beneath it, refolded his blanket with hospital corners tight enough to bounce a coin on, and moved to the next room before the door had fully closed behind her. Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrived at 6:45 in the morning, which meant he would make rounds before the day shift arrived, which meant he would see what Hannah had already done before anyone else could take credit for it. His family name was carved into the east wing cornerstone in letters thick enough to read from the parking lot, the kind of carved-in stone permanence that only came from either saving lives or saving money, and based on the way his eyes moved across patient charts, Hannah suspected it was the latter. He had the kind of posture that came from never hearing the word no, the kind of confidence that only existed in men who'd never been reduced to asking the universe for permission to keep breathing. His white coat probably cost more than her monthly rent. His watch probably cost more than her car. The medication order on room 309 had been written at 6:15 a.m. The patient was a 62-year-old man with a fever that had climbed steadily through the night, 102.3 when Hannah had checked at midnight, 103.4 at 2 a.m., 104.1 at 4 a.m. The sepsis panels hadn't come back yet, but the blood cultures were showing early colonization. The man's wife was asleep in the bedside chair, her hand resting on his arm. Caldwell had written the order without reviewing the imaging that had come through at 5:30 a.m., without checking whether the third-generation cephalosporin he'd prescribed was the right choice, without noting that this particular organism had been flagged for resistance in the notes from the admitting physician. Hannah had seen it the moment she'd pulled the chart to verify the order before administration. She'd read the imaging. She'd cross-referenced the culture sensitivities. She'd calculated the dosing against both weight and renal function. She'd corrected him quietly, at 6:42 a.m., in the hallway outside his patient's room, with her voice kept low enough that no one else could hear, with her hands folded in front of her like she was asking permission instead of preventing a medical error. Dr. Caldwell. The blood cultures came back at 5:30. Gram-negative rod. The resistance panel shows reduced susceptibility to third-gen cephalosporins. You might want to consider meropenem or fluoroquinolone instead. The imaging also shows some hepatic involvement, so the renal dosing on page 4 should account for. His jaw tightened. A single muscle, right at the corner of his mouth, contracted like he'd just tasted something bitter. He was tall enough that she had to look up to maintain eye contact, and she didn't maintain eye contact, because maintaining eye contact with someone like that was a kind of challenge she'd learned not to throw. She kept her gaze on his stethoscope instead, on the slight wrinkle in his white coat from where he'd been sitting in the physician's lounge. "I'm aware of the imaging, nurse." He said it the way you might speak to someone who'd just explained how to tie their own shoes, like the words themselves took effort, like every syllable was a small act of condescension. His voice was the kind of voice that had never been questioned, that had grown soft from disuse of actual argument. Money and status did that to voices, made them lazy, made them assume the world was listening even when it wasn't. Hannah had known men with voices like that before. She'd worked with them, under them, sometimes directly in their line of fire. They'd all had the same confidence. Most of them had also been wrong. The chart notes recommend verifying organism specificity before final selection, she said, and she kept her voice exactly where it needed to be, not deferential, not challenging, just flat and informational, the way you'd read a protocol to someone who claimed they knew the protocol already. Since the sensitivities are available, it seemed relevant. "Thank you for the clinical input, nurse." He turned away from her. The rejection was complete. "I'll make the final call on treatment decisions." He walked toward the next patient room with his white coat moving like a cape behind him, and Hannah stood in the hallway watching the back of his head with something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite fear, something that sat between both emotions like a third thing entirely. She'd made him look foolish in front of no one, actually. The hallway was empty. The wife was asleep. The patient probably wouldn't remember this conversation an hour from now. But Caldwell would remember it. Men like Caldwell built their entire understanding of the world around the assumption that they were the smartest people in every room, and when that assumption got rattled, even slightly, even in private, they spent the rest of their lives trying to fix it. She returned to room 309 and administered the medication he'd ordered anyway, because that's what nurses did. They followed the orders of the attending physician, even when the medication would be ineffective, even when it would delay proper treatment, even when they knew, because they always knew, that they were watching something that could have been prevented. The patient's wife woke up just as Hannah was adjusting the 4-8. Her name was Susan. She'd introduced herself on admission at 10 p.m., had asked Hannah 3 times if someone could please keep her husband comfortable, had held his hand through the night while his fever climbed and his body tried to fight something it didn't have the tools to fight. She looked at Hannah now with the desperate hopefulness that came from believing that nurses were the ones who actually did the saving, not the doctors, that the people in scrubs were the ones paying attention while the people in white coats made decisions with their eyes half closed. "Is he going to be okay?" Susan asked. Hannah didn't lie. She also didn't tell the truth. She did something in between. She smiled without showing teeth, reached down and straightened the blanket again, and said, "We're going to take very good care of him." And that wasn't a lie, not exactly. She would take care of him. She would check his vitals every 2 hours instead of 4. She would monitor his response to the medication that probably wouldn't work. She would be the one who noticed the moment something changed, the moment the fever broke or the moment it didn't. She would be the one standing at the bedside at 3 in the morning when the machines decided to tell him goodbye. That was what invisible meant. It meant doing the work no one saw, being the person no one remembered, carrying the weight of things that happened in the hours when the lights were low and the world was asleep. She moved through the rest of her rounds with the kind of precision that came from a different kind of training entirely. Blood pressure checks and for assessments and the kind of minute-by-minute attention that separated living patients from dying ones. By the time the day shift arrived at 7 a.m., she'd already documented everything twice, had already flagged the labs she thought would matter, had already made herself invisible again in the way that mattered most. Dr. Caldwell's rounds continued past room 309 without another glance. The overhead PA crackled at 0600 exactly. Hannah was restocking the med cart on 3 when the voice came through, deliberately formal, deliberately loud, Nurse Nightingale to the attending's office. Nurse Nightingale, your presence is required immediately. The entire floor went still. 30 heads turned toward her in the main station. She felt the weight of it, the eyes, the whispers already starting, the terrible knowledge that a nickname weaponized publicly becomes a scar. Hannah set down the 4 bags with the same precision she'd used threading a needle through an artery. Her hands did not shake. Her pulse stayed below 60. Dr. Marcus Caldwell stood in his doorway like he owned the building, because in a way he did. His family's name was on the East Wing in brass letters. His grandfather had donated the pediatric wing. His confidence was institutional, generational, armored in the kind of wealth that teaches you the world bends to accommodation. He smiled as she approached, and that smile was the worst thing about him, not anger, not passion, but the serene certainty of a man who had never faced real consequences. There she is. His voice carried across the floor. 2 residents looked up from their charts. A nursing assistant paused near the coffee station. Our resident expert on my prescribing decisions. Tell me, Clarke, did you get your medical degree online, or did you just acquire all that expertise through osmosis? He gestured vaguely at the unit. We call nurses like you nightingales. Florence was wonderful with bedpans too. Very dedicated to patient comfort. No actual medicine, mind you, but comfort. One of the residents snickered. The other followed suit, the way young physicians do when they sense which way the current flows. Hannah took one measured breath. The kind of breath you take before you squeeze the trigger. Before you lead a convoy through hostile terrain. The kind of breath that means you've already decided what happens next. She maintained eye contact with Caldwell, and when a single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear but from the precise calculus of every moment of restraint she'd ever practiced, she wiped it away without breaking that gaze. Her voice came out like still water over stone. Flat. Inevitable. Ancient. I've stood before better men than you and watched them fall. Caldwell's smile widened. He thought it was capitulation. He thought her tears meant surrender. Careful, Clarke. You're dangerously close to insubordination. He stepped back into his office. We'll be watching you more carefully now. Make sure you remember your lane. She walked back to the med cart. Her spine was straight. Her hands were steady. Her breathing remained controlled. No trembling. No voice crack. No retreat to a supply closet to compose herself. The 75th Regiment patch sewn inside her scrub jacket lining, the only piece of her past she carried into this civilian life, pressed against her ribs like a secret heartbeat. Caldwell didn't notice any of it. But the strategic pieces were already moving. He'd had 3 years to watch her work, 3 years to see the way patients responded to her presence, the way other nurses deferred to her judgment in quiet moments. 3 years to understand that Hannah Clarke was dangerous precisely because she never demanded power. She simply had it, the way some people have steady hands or perfect pitch. It was intrinsic. It was immune to hierarchy. So he began the escalation with precision. At 1400, she was alone in the supply closet restocking chest tubes when the door closed behind her. Caldwell stood between her and the exit, blocking the space with deliberate positioning. The overhead lights hummed their fluorescent song. The smell of antiseptic and cardboard surrounded them, her territory, and now his invasion of it. That little correction you made this morning cost me credibility with the chief. His voice was soft, which made it worse. 12 years I've been attending at Sacred Heart. 12 years of advancing their reputation, their surgical outcomes, their standing in the state. And you, 3 years of pushing a cart, you think you can countermand my clinical orders in front of residents. He stepped closer. The room compressed. If you ever do that again, I will personally ensure you're working bedside at a county facility by end of week. County clinic. Straight nights. The kind of place where nurses ask permission to use the bathroom. Do you understand me? Hannah's pulse remained steady. I understand exactly who you are, doctor. He mistook her composure for weakness. He thought the slight tremor in her voice, which wasn't fear but pure, weaponized restraint, meant she was breaking. He left satisfied, certain he'd made his point. The final blow came at shift change in the parking lot. Day shift was arriving, 37 people streaming through the entrance with coffee cups and fresh scrubs. Caldwell was waiting, and with him was Patricia Vance from HR, a woman Hannah had seen exactly twice, both times in passing. Caldwell's voice rang out across the asphalt like he was announcing something celebratory. Nurse Clarke. This is Patricia Vance from Human Resources. Effective immediately, you're on probationary status pending a formal performance review. Patricia will be monitoring your patient interactions, your documentation, your adherence to physician directives. Closely. He handed her a single sheet of paper. Sign here. 27 staff members witnessed it. She could count them because the part of her brain that had been trained to count hostile actors never shut off. 27 people watching her dignity get dismantled in the morning light. The form trembled slightly in Vance's hands, not Hannah's. Hannah's hands were absolutely steady as she signed her name in the signature she'd used in hospitals for 7 years, the civilian signature that was not the one on her discharge papers. Caldwell smiled again. Anything you want to say, Nightingale? Hannah looked at him for 3 full seconds. Her eyes were the color of a northern lake in winter, blue-gray, absolutely still, with something moving underneath that you couldn't quite see. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave from that morning's whisper. It wasn't a request. It was a command. I've stood before better men than you and watched them fall. She turned and walked back inside, her spine parade ground straight, while Caldwell laughed with Vance about dramatic nurses and emotional instability. He didn't see the patch beneath her jacket. He didn't see the Silver Star citation that lived in a locked drawer in her apartment, wrapped in plastic, sealed away. He saw a target. He was already orchestrating Phase 2, confident in the systematic destruction of a woman he believed was nothing but a bedside nurse with delusions of medical expertise. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came at 0200 the next night when the trauma bay exploded into controlled chaos. The level 1 rolled in like a thunderstorm, and Hannah heard it before she saw it, the urgent radio chatter from EMS, the collision of the stretcher against the trauma bay doors, the rapid-fire orders that meant something catastrophic had arrived. Massive internal bleeding. Tension pneumothorax. IED strike near Sangin, Afghanistan. She caught those details from Morrison's intake call, and the world suddenly tilted on its axis because Sangin was where Hannah had been for 14 months. Sangin was the place she wasn't supposed to think about, the place that lived in her reconstructed shoulder and in the small scars on her hands and in the specific way her breathing sometimes changed when helicopter rotors echoed overhead. The captain was 29 years old. His name was Jason Reeves. His exposed shoulder bore the tattoo she knew better than she knew the back of her own hands, the scroll design of the 75th Ranger Regiment, the same unit patch sewn inside her scrub jacket lining. His BP was crashing. His chest was a constellation of fragmentation wounds. He was wearing a KIA bracelet on his wrist with names she might have known. Dr. Morrison led the code with Caldwell observing, calling orders rapid fire, intubate, chest tube, 2 units O negative, prep for emergency thoracotomy. The team moved like a choreography they'd learned through repetition, efficient and practiced. Hannah moved to assist, but Caldwell stepped directly between her and the table. His voice was ice. "Probationary nurses observe only, Clarke. Stand against that wall." She backed up, her heart hammering against her ribs like it was trying to escape. She watched them work on a ranger. She watched Morrison's hands move with precision and speed. She watched the monitors spike and fall. She watched them lose him. The captain's heart stopped at 0214. Morrison started compressions, called for epi, shocked him twice. The team responded in practiced unison. Nothing. At 0221 his heart stopped again. Morrison worked for 4 more minutes, checking the monitor, checking his watch, reading the language that only physicians and soldiers truly understand, the language of accepted defeat. At 0225 he stepped back. "I'm calling it. Time of death 0225. The team began the ritual of stepping back, stripping gloves, the choreography of accepted failure. The room's energy shifted from urgency to routine. The captain was dead. The code was closed. The trauma bay moved on because trauma bays always move on. But Hannah saw what they didn't. She saw the specific pattern of the chest wound. She saw the location, the angle, the mechanism of injury. She'd seen this exact wound before. In 2019. On a different table. On a different body that she'd saved using hands and knowledge and the specific kind of desperation that comes from refusing to let one more kid from your unit die on your watch. She moved without thinking. Her feet were already walking. Her hands were already moving. The muscle memory of a different life was overriding 3 years of civilian caution. 3 words came out, quiet as prayer. "He's not gone." The trauma bay doors exploded inward at 0200 hours. Stretcher. Screaming. The smell of diesel exhaust and copper blood mixing with the hospital's sterile antiseptic veil. The paramedics were still calling vitals as they transferred the patient, a young Army Ranger captain, maybe 26, his combat uniform shredded from IED fragmentation, his left chest wall collapsed inward like someone had scooped out the cavity with a spoon. Tension pneumothorax. Internal bleeding. The kind of injury that took men in minutes if you didn't know exactly what you were doing. Hannah stood at the bedside while Dr. Morrison began the rapid assessment, fingers probing the captain's ribs, listening to the absence of breath sounds on the left side. The monitors were already screaming. Oxygen saturation dropping. Blood pressure collapsing. 120/80. 110/70. The numbers falling like a stock market on fire. She saw the tattoo first. Black ink on the captain's right shoulder, partially visible beneath the torn fabric of his desert combat shirt. The crossed rifles. The scroll beneath it. The 75th Ranger Regiment symbol, the same mark that was sewn into her own jacket lining, hidden against her ribs like a secret heartbeat she'd carried for 3 years. Not just the same unit. The same battalion. Dark Horse. Her battalion. The one she'd left behind when an RPG blast ended her career and sent her to Norfolk to disappear into the night shifts and the invisible work of keeping people alive in the dark. The captain's eyes were open. Glazed. Scanning the room with the kind of panic you only saw in men who understood exactly how close death was standing. His hand reached out. Not for the doctors. For Hannah. For the 75th patch that no one else in this room could possibly understand meant anything at all. She didn't reach back. Couldn't. 3 years of civilian protocols had taught her that touching was contamination. That stepping back was professionalism. That the best nurses were the ones no one noticed. His heart stopped. The monitors flat-lined. The alarm cut through the trauma bay like an air raid siren. Morrison was already moving, calling for defibrillation pads, pushing epinephrine, running the code with the kind of mechanical precision that only came after hundreds of these moments. The chest compressions began. 1 compression every second. The captain's ribs flexing under Morrison's hands. The monitor flickering. Nothing. Just the mechanical rhythm of a dead man's chest being forced to move. 2 minutes. The compressions continued. Morrison's face was expressionless. This was act. This was procedure. This was the job. 3 minutes. The captain's heart stopped a second time. The monitor flatlined again. This time it didn't jump back. The compressions continued for another 60 seconds, Morrison going through the motions, the ritual of working a code even when there was nothing to work toward. The EKG remained a flat line. A perfect, empty line. The sound of the monitor became a tone. A continuous tone. The sound of a man's heart giving up. Morrison stepped back. His hands dropped to his sides. He looked at the clock. Looked at the captain's face. Made a decision that had already been made the moment the IED blast happened somewhere in Sangin Valley, thousands of miles away, a decision made by physics and velocity and the simple mathematics of trauma. Time of death, 0207 hours, Morrison said quietly. The room began to clear. A nurse turned off the monitor. Another started removing the defibrillation pads. Someone pulled a blanket up over the captain's face, not because it mattered, but because that was what you did. That was the ritual that meant you accepted death. That meant you walked away. The rest of the trauma team was already moving toward the door. Already thinking about the next patient, the one they could actually save, the one whose injuries hadn't transcended the boundary between medical emergency and message from God. The captain was released. Code concluded. Death accepted. Hannah didn't move. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something deeper. Something that lived in the muscle memory of field triage under fire. Something that remembered 7 soldiers, 7 men she'd pulled back from the edge of nothing while rounds snapped overhead and the dust from mortar strikes rained down like biblical plagues. 7 men who were supposed to be dead but weren't because she'd kept working when everyone else was already planning the memorial service. The captain's hand was still reaching. Still open. His eye still locked on the 75th patch she carried like a stone in her chest. Morrison was at the door. Caldwell hadn't even come to this code. Probationary nurses didn't get to call senior attending physicians down to trauma bays. It was just Morrison and the residents and the nurses and a captain from Dark Horse Battalion who'd survived an IED blast and 3,000 miles of transport only to die on a stretcher because his chest cavity had collapsed in exactly the wrong way. Except it hadn't collapsed all the way. Hannah's eyes were on the captain's chest. On the way it was rising and falling. Not breathing. Not real respiration. Something else. Something that looked like air hunger. The kind of movement a body makes when it's fighting compression. When something's pressing down on the heart from the outside and the body's last reflex is to try to breathe through it. Pericardial tamponade. The fluid accumulating around the heart from the internal bleeding. The pressure building. The chambers compressed. The pump failing not because the muscle was dead but because something was crushing it from the outside. She was moving before her mind caught up. 3 years of night shifts, 3 years of invisible competence, 3 years of being the nurse nobody noticed, all of it evaporated. Her hands knew what to do. The muscle memory didn't care about protocols. Didn't care about probation or Caldwell or the careful, invisible life she'd built in Norfolk. Her hands knew exactly how to do field thoracotomy. Knew exactly how to crack a chest cavity open when the alternative was watching someone die from compression they could have survived. Morrison was still at the door. He hadn't left yet. He was watching something in Hannah's expression. Something he couldn't quite place. She grabbed the ultrasound machine from the trauma bay wall. Moved it over the captain's chest. Placed the transducer right where she needed it. The screen flickered to life. Grey and black and the unmistakable image of pericardial fluid surrounding the heart like a dark cloud around a dying star. The heart itself was barely moving. Barely squeezing. A muscle being crushed by the very fluid that was supposed to protect it. Pericardial effusion with tamponade, Hannah said. Her voice was different now. Lower. The voice of someone who wasn't asking permission. We need to drain it now or his brain stops perfusing in 90 seconds. Caldwell's voice came from the doorway. He'd arrived while the monitor was flat-lined. Had stood there watching the code die. Had been waiting for this moment. Nurse Clarke, step away from that patient immediately. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge him. She was already moving toward the crash cart, already finding the needle, 18 gauge, long enough to reach through the sternum into the pericardial sac. Already moving like someone who'd done this before under fire, under pressure, under the kind of circumstances that made protocols into suggestions. You are on probation, Caldwell continued, his voice taking on the hard edge of someone using words as weapons. You are not permitted to touch this patient. This code is concluded. The patient is deceased. Step away now or I will have you removed from this hospital by security and reported to the State Nursing Board for psychological instability and violation of direct physician orders. Hannah's hands were steady. The kind of steady that only came from absolute certainty. She prepped the captain's chest. Found the xiphoid process. Located the angle. Everything compressed into a single point of focus where the world narrowed to anatomy and physics and the simple fact that a man with a 75th Regiment tattoo was still alive somewhere under the pressure that was killing him. Morrison hadn't left. He was watching. His expression was unreadable but his feet hadn't moved toward the exit. He'd seen something in that ultrasound. The fluid. The compression. The truth written in grey pixels on a screen. Caldwell stepped toward her. Reached for her arm. I said step away. His heart's compressed, Hannah said quietly. She positioned the needle. Not dead. Compressed. There's a difference. There is no difference when I am ordering you to stop. She pushed the needle in. Felt the familiar give of tissue giving way. The sternum. The pericardium. The needle slid through and the moment it breached the pericardial sac, the ultrasound showed the fluid beginning to drain. The heart suddenly had space again. Room to expand. Room to beat. The monitor beeped. 1 QRS complex. Weak. Barely there. But real. The heart's own electrical system firing. The muscle contracting. Movement where there had been flat line. Caldwell's hand was still on her arm but his grip had loosened. He was staring at the monitor. At the EKG tracing that shouldn't exist. At a man who was supposed to be dead but wasn't. Get him to OR, Morrison said. His voice had changed. The exhaustion was gone. Replaced by the sharp focus of someone who'd just been given a second chance. Type and cross. 2 units of ONEG ready to go. We're going to need vascular and trauma surgery standing by. Move. The room exploded into motion. The captain was alive in a way that made all the previous protocols irrelevant. A man you could save was different from a man who was gone. A man you could save demanded action. Hannah looked at the captain's face. At the tattoo. At the open eyes that were starting to focus. Starting to recognize that he wasn't dead. That somewhere between the IED blast and the trauma bay, someone had decided he was worth fighting for. Caldwell's grip on her arm tightened again. But she was already walking. Already moving with the stretcher toward the operating room. Already moving like someone who'd stepped across a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Like someone who'd just chosen the only thing that mattered more than her invisible life in Norfolk. The 75th patch pressed against her ribs like a second heartbeat. The secret she'd carried for 3 years was about to become impossible to hide. The trauma room door swings inward, and Hannah's hand finds the lock mechanism before anyone can process the motion. Her fingers close around the metal. She twists. The click echoes through the bay like a gunshot. Caldwell spins, his face shifting from red to purple. What the hell are you doing, Clarke? Unlock that door immediately. His voice cracks on the last word, the sound of a man whose control is fragmenting. Pounding erupts from the opposite side. Fists on reinforced glass. Nurses screaming. Hannah, open up. Hannah, you can't lock us out. Morrison's voice, terrified and pleading. But Hannah doesn't hear them anymore. The captain's chest heaves once more, a final involuntary reflex. Not a breath. Not life. Just muscles firing their last commands before the engine goes silent. She strips his chest in for precise movements. Betadine. The orange liquid runs across pale skin like spilled sunset. Her hands move with the fluid certainty of someone who has done this before, on the opposite side of a continent, with rounds incoming and dust in her teeth. The scalpel from the crash cart feels different from the combat knife she used in Sangin, sterile, surgical, proper. But her hands remember the technique. 7 years of civilian medicine collapses into nothing the moment steel breaks skin. The incision follows the fourth intercostal space. Muscle memory, not thought. Her fingers find the pericardium, feel the fluid compressing the heart like a closed fist. She punctures the membrane. Blood and serum pour out, the compressed chamber finally allowed to expand. The captain's heart is still. Cool beneath her fingertips. A organ that has forgotten how to beat. Caldwell is screaming into his cell phone. Yes, I'm serious. Unauthorized procedure. Criminal negligence. She's performing an emergency thoracotomy on a patient I call time of death on. I need the chief of medicine. I need the board. I need hospital security now. His voice has the quality of a man documenting a crime, narrating his own victory while watching it unfold. The phone pressed to his ear like a weapon he's about to fire. Hannah's hands are inside the captain's chest cavity. She finds the heart. It feels small. Fragile. Like holding something that was never meant to survive. She begins compressions, both hands cradling the muscle, working it between her palms, forcing blood through chambers that have forgotten their rhythm. She counts like she did in Sangin, in Kandahar, in a dozen firefights where rangers fell and she kneeled over them in the dust, refusing to let death claim what was hers to save. 20 compressions. The heart twitches. Not a beat. A spasm. She continues. 30. 40. 50. The tissue gradually warms between her hands, responding to her urgency, to the fact that she will not accept what Caldwell has already decided. The monitor is silent except for Caldwell's voice and the pounding on the door and the hiss of the ventilator pushing air into lungs that don't know they're supposed to use it. 70 compressions. The heart stumbles. An arrhythmia, disorganized electrical fire, neurons misfiring in panic. Better than nothing. Better than the flat line that preceded it. Hannah adjusts her technique. Cardiac massage with precision, working the organ like she's coaxing it to remember why it was designed to beat. Morrison is frozen against the wall, his eyes wide behind his surgical mask, watching through the lens of someone who has never seen a nurse do this. Who has never seen a nurse do anything but follow orders and defer to men in white coats. 90 compressions. The captain's blood pressure is 0. The perfusion is coming entirely from Hannah's hands. 100 compressions. The monitor hiccups. A single beat appears on the screen, isolated, tentative, like a heartbeat unsure of itself. Then silence. Then rhythm. The machine screams to life with a steady beep. The captain's heart beats under Hannah's hands, strong and sure, and she feels the moment his blood pressure stabilizes, sees it climb on the monitor from 0 to 40 to 60 to 80. A prayer answered by the machinery of a human body that was never meant to die, only to be given permission to live again. She holds pressure. Manages bleeding. Calls instructions to Morrison in a voice that no longer belongs to the timid night nurse who corrects dangerous medication orders in the supply closet. This voice comes from somewhere deeper. Older. A voice that has given commands to men under fire and expected those commands to be followed because lives depended on it. Suction. Clamp. Suture. Cardiovascular hemostat, now. Morrison moves on autopilot, his training overriding his shock. His hands shake but they obey. Clamp. Suture. Pressure dressing. The mechanics of saving a life that was already supposed to be dead. Caldwell is still screaming into his phone. The words have lost their meaning. They're just noise now, the sound of a man documenting a crime he never understood was happening. At 0247 hours, the captain's vitals stabilize enough to transfer to ICU. His blood pressure holds. His oxygen saturation climbs. His heart beats on its own, no longer dependent on Hannah's hands to keep it alive. She withdraws her fingers and looks at them. The captain's blood has dried in the creases of her palms, staining the whorls of her fingerprints. The evidence of what she's done, written in crimson across her skin. Morrison closes the chest under her instruction. Hannah unlocks the door. Security floods in like water through a broken dam. 2 officers in dark uniforms, hands on their belts, faces set with the expression of men following orders they don't yet understand. Caldwell stands in the doorway with his cell phone still pressed to his ear, his face scarlet with vindication. He has been proven right about her inadequacy, about her instability, about her fundamental inability to follow protocol. The fact that the patient is alive is irrelevant. The fact that she saved a man he had pronounced dead is beside the point. She broke rules. That is the only truth that matters. Arrest her, Caldwell says into the phone, then repeats it to the security officers. Unauthorized procedure. Criminal negligence. Assault on a deceased patient. His voice carries the weight of institutional authority, the full gravity of a man with family name on hospital wings behind him. Patricia Vance from HR emerges from behind the officers with termination paperwork already printed, already waiting, as if this outcome was predetermined before Hannah ever locked that door. The perp walk is executed with the precision of men trained to follow protocol. Hannah's wrists are secured, not cuffed, not yet, but guided with the kind of firmness that communicates she is no longer an employee of Sacred Heart but a problem to be removed. Her bloody scrubs mark her passage through the hallway. Every nurse on the night shift sees her. Every resident freezing mid-note. Every tech pausing to stare. The woman who was invisible is now impossible to ignore, moving past them like a prisoner of war, escorted through a hospital that had decided she no longer existed. The locker room is silent except for the metallic clink of her security badge being confiscated. Her employee ID. Her parking pass. The credentials that had given her access to the building for 3 years. Caldwell watches from the doorway, his presence like a surveillance camera, documenting her erasure. He says nothing. He doesn't need to. His expression is sufficient, the look of a man witnessing the completion of a project he had begun. "You're done in medicine, Clarke," he says, finally breaking his silence. His voice is quieter now, almost conversational, which somehow makes it worse. "I'll make sure every hospital in Virginia knows your name. What you did here. Your instability, your disregard for hierarchy, your complete inability to follow basic protocol." He lets that settle. "No one will hire you. Not after I'm finished." Hannah's hands begin to tremble. Not from fear. Not from regret. But from the cascade of adrenaline finally leaving her system, from the return of civilian nervous system after 3 minutes of pure combat medicine. Her fingers shake as she removes her scrubs. She folds them carefully, the same way she folded field uniforms in barracks in Kandahar, the same way she learned to be neat in a profession where small mistakes became big problems. The fabric still smells of betadine and the captain's blood and the particular metallic scent of trauma bays that she thought she had left behind. By 0900, Dr. Caldwell has reassigned every nurse who witnessed the save to different floors and shifts. Morrison goes to pediatrics. Janet goes to orthopedics. The 3 nurses who pounded on the door are scattered across the hospital like evidence being destroyed. No coherent testimony possible. No unified narrative that might survive legal scrutiny. Just isolated voices, each in different parts of the building, unable to corroborate or support each other. At 1600 hours, Hannah sits alone in her apartment, folding her scrubs one final time. The fabric rustles with each fold, a sound like surrender. The betadine stain won't wash out. Neither will the captain's blood, now dried and brown against the pale blue cotton. She places the folded uniform in a hospital laundry bag, the kind they provide for employees to return soiled scrubs. 3 years of rebuilding her civilian life, erased in 3 minutes of locked doors and muscle memory and the refusal to let a man die because a more prestigious man had already decided he was dead. The faded 75th Regiment patch sits on her kitchen table, removed from the scrub jacket lining where it had lived like her second heartbeat. She stares at it. The colors have faded to near invisibility, the embroidered Ranger scrolls barely distinguishable from their backing. She doesn't regret pulling it out. She doesn't regret the save. She doesn't regret the locked door or Caldwell's rage or the termination paperwork or the systematic erasure of her presence from the hospital where she had worked for 3 years as someone other than who she actually was. But that doesn't stop the shaking. That doesn't silence the voice in her head that sounds like Caldwell, repeating the same words, "You're done. No one will hire you. Your instability. Your disregard. Your inability to follow protocol." She sits with the shaking. She sits with the trembling hands and the trembling mind and the knowledge that she has just walked away from everything she rebuilt, but that she would do it again. Would lock that door again. Would crack open that chest again. Would massage a dead man's heart back to life again. But the next day, everything changes. The next day, the sound arrives before anyone can see it coming. The heavy rhythmic percussion of rotor blades cutting through Virginia's sky. The distinctive thunder of military helicopters. And with them, answers to questions no one at Sacred Heart had ever been permitted to ask. The perp walk happened at 7:08 when the day shift was arriving and the parking lot was full of witnesses. Dr. Caldwell had orchestrated it perfectly, like a surgical strike designed to obliterate everything. Security escorted Hannah down the main corridor with her badge already deactivated, her locker assignment deleted from the system, her employment record being scrubbed from the hospital database like she'd never existed at all. Nurses she'd worked with for 3 years averted their eyes. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody said anything. The silence was so thick you could operate in it. Caldwell stood near the nurse's station watching her leave, his expression arranged into something between concern and professional regret. He'd already made the calls. HR had the narrative, unauthorized emergency procedures, flagrant protocol violations, psychological instability demonstrated by her obsessive behavior and her refusal to accept established hierarchy. The story was clean. The story was defensible. The story was a lie built with surgical precision. In his office at 0900, Caldwell called Richard Hastings, his medical school roommate and current vice chairman of the hospital board. The phone rang twice. "Richard, I need you to hear my side before this gets out of hand." Silence on the other end. Not the silence of listening. The silence of someone already knowing. "The military posturing doesn't change hospital protocol," Caldwell continued, his voice steady, confident. "She violated direct orders. She performed an unauthorized thoracotomy. She's unstable. I had to protect the institution." Hastings cut him off with 4 words, "The board knows." "Already?" Caldwell's stomach dropped. "What board? What do you mean knows?" "State Medical Board just received a formal complaint. With evidence. Full documentation. Everything." The phone felt heavier in Caldwell's hand. His mouth went dry. "What evidence?" "Richard, there is no evidence. I handled this internally. I removed her from." But Hastings had already hung up. In the server room on the 3rd floor, Danny Torres was sitting at a workstation surrounded by 3 external hard drives and the kind of quiet certainty that only comes from someone who's already made his peace with the consequences. Torres was a Marine Corps veteran, 2 tours in Fallujah, and he'd watched Hannah Clarke work overnight shifts for 3 years. He'd seen the way she moved, fluid, precise, without wasted motion. The way she carried herself when she thought nobody was looking. That bearing. He recognized it from downrange. He'd seen it on the faces of the best soldiers he'd ever known. When Caldwell had ordered him yesterday to delete the security footage of the thoracotomy, Torres had said, "Yes, sir," and instead backed up every frame to 3 separate drives using a hospital IT account that wouldn't be flagged in the audit logs. He'd been waiting for this. Now he was on the phone with the state medical board, walking an investigator named Patricia Chen through the metadata, showing her the timestamp on Caldwell's deletion orders, providing the original footage of Hannah's save alongside the command structure that proved his intent. The footage showed everything. Morrison calling time of death. The team walking away. Hannah's assessment with her hands moving on their own, the kind of muscle memory that doesn't come from nursing school. Caldwell physically blocking her from the patient. His phone call audible in the background, "Remove her. Remove her now." The heart monitor still showing flatline resistance, then the electrical defibrillation, then the first sign of organized activity. Then sinus rhythm. "That's evidence of retaliation," Chen said quietly. "An attempted destruction of evidence. Both federal violations." Torres didn't respond. He was watching the footage again, watching Hannah's hands, watching the moment she brought a man back from death using nothing but training and will and the kind of composure that doesn't break under pressure. That was worth protecting. By 1100, Patricia Vance from HR received a call from the state medical board requesting all documentation related to Hannah Clarke's probationary status and her termination. She pulled the file. She read the performance complaints Caldwell had submitted. Both were fabricated. She knew Hannah's work record, meticulous, reliable, unremarkable in the way of people who do their job perfectly and ask for nothing in return. Vance called her attorney before Caldwell could call her. By 1300, 3 nurses Caldwell had reassigned to different shifts, morning rotation, swing shift, days off, had filed witness statements with the board. Each one confirmed that Hannah's intervention was appropriate and that Caldwell had retaliated against her for refusing to accept his protocol violation with a patient medication dose that would have been lethal. By 1400, Dr. Morrison provided a written statement to the board that Hannah's assessment of pericardial tamponade was clinically sound, her intervention was medically justified, and his decision to call time of death had been premature based on incomplete assessment. He'd been wrong. She'd been right. The patient was alive. By 1500, the hospital board requested Caldwell's immediate resignation pending investigation. Caldwell sat in his office staring at his medical license on the wall, the gold-embossed frame with his family name engraved below it, the certificate that represented everything his family had built in this institution for 3 generations. His hands weren't shaking. That surprised him. He'd thought they would shake. His wife called at 1600. "Marcus, Richard Hastings just called me. He said you're being investigated for evidence tampering and retaliation. What the hell did you do?" He didn't answer. He was thinking about the parking lot, about the moment when Hannah had looked at him with those eyes that held no anger, no fear, just absolute clarity. "I've stood before better men than you and watched them fall," she'd said. And he'd thought she was threatening him. He was realizing now that she wasn't threatening anything. She was stating a fact. She was giving him information about how this would end. By 1700, his attorney called with news that the state medical board was pursuing emergency suspension of his license, effective immediately, pending a full investigation into his conduct. By 1800, another call, the hospital was moving forward with termination for cause. Breach of ethics. Destruction of evidence. Retaliation against protected whistleblowing. Caldwell looked at the diploma on the wall. Johns Hopkins, top of his class. He looked at the photos, his family at various hospital galas, his name in the hospital newsletter, articles about his cardiac innovation that had been praised at national conferences. All of it was about to be gone. He was thinking about the patient when the last call came. Captain Jason Reeves. Alive. Conscious. Asking for the major by her call sign. The name Caldwell had never known because Hannah Clarke had never told him anything about herself that mattered. He'd seen someone small and deferential, and he'd assumed that was all there was. He'd been wrong in a way that was now destroying him in real time, systematically, professionally, completely. That afternoon, while Caldwell was making the worst phone calls of his life, Hannah was sitting alone in her apartment folding her scrubs one final time. She'd worn them home, still damp with betadine and the particular smell of the trauma bay at 3 in the morning. The fabric was still clinging to her skin in places, tacky and cold. She removed them with the same careful precision she'd used to crack Captain Reeves' chest, and she folded each piece, the shirt, the pants, the disposable booties, into the laundry bag that would return them to Sacred Heart's processing facility. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something else. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the same restraint that had kept her invisible for 3 years, that had turned her into someone so quiet that people forgot she existed unless they needed her to save their lives. Now she was shaking because she'd finally let herself be seen, and they'd tried to destroy her for it, and somewhere in the mechanics of what was happening, her entire identity was unraveling. She placed the bag on her kitchen counter and sat down at her table and stared at nothing for a very long time. The news hit Norfolk's medical community like a shock wave that nobody had predicted. State Medical Board investigation into Dr. Marcus Caldwell for evidence destruction, retaliation, and falsification of employee records. Emergency suspension of license. Criminal referral to the Norfolk Police Department for obstruction of justice. The hospital board statement was clinical and brief. Sacred Heart Medical Center does not tolerate violations of our ethical standards or our commitment to patient safety. What the board statement didn't say was that Hannah Clarke's intervention had been legally and ethically justified, that the patient she'd saved was a decorated soldier, that the doctor who'd tried to destroy her for that intervention had been competent at hiding his crimes until someone from the Marine Corps decided the truth mattered more than protocol. 6 months later, Danny Torres received a commendation from the State Medical Board for his role in the investigation. He didn't go to the ceremony. He just got the plaque and hung it in his office in the hospital IT department, right next to a photograph of his unit in Fallujah, right next to the names of the 17 Marines he'd served with who didn't come home. And Marcus Caldwell was sitting at a folding table outside a strip mall in the outskirts of Norfolk, selling supplemental insurance plans that nobody wanted to buy. His medical license was revoked. His family name, which had adorned the east wing of Sacred Heart for 43 years, had been formally removed from the building. The gold lettering came down on a Tuesday morning at 0600, before most of the staff arrived, which meant Caldwell didn't have to watch it happen. He found out from his former colleagues when they didn't return his calls. Hannah didn't know about the insurance table at first. She was too busy with the other parts of her new life. The State Medical Board's formal apology. The Hospital Board's formal apology. Back pay for 3 years of lost wages. The offer to lead their new initiative for hiring and supporting combat veteran medical professionals. The request to develop new trauma protocols that incorporated her assessment methods into the standard training. Captain Reeves recovered enough to travel, and she stood in Class A dress uniform at Walter Reed Medical Center and pinned his promotion to captain, her reconstructed shoulder straight under the weight of her own major's insignia, catching the light like a final answer to every question that had been asked about who she was. But one afternoon in late November, she found herself driving past that strip mall for reasons she didn't want to examine too closely. Through the window, she saw him. Caldwell. Sitting at a folding table with laminated brochures and a smile that didn't reach his eyes, trying to look like a man who still belonged somewhere. Hannah didn't go inside. She didn't gloat. She didn't say anything. She simply looked at him for 3 seconds, the same measured look she'd given him in the parking lot, the one that had promised nothing except truth. Caldwell's eyes met hers once, and something in his face broke. She continued walking. That evening, she returned to Sacred Heart where the board had reinstated her with full honors and a new title. Major Hannah Clarke. U.S. Army, retired. 75th Ranger Regiment. Her unit patch, the faded one she'd carried in her scrub jacket lining for 3 years, was professionally framed on the wall of the trauma bay with a plaque beneath it that read simply, Valkyrie. The old call sign. The one that meant something again. Dr. Morrison approached as she was staring at the frame, his movements respectful, his voice quiet. The new trauma protocols you suggested are going into effect next month. The board wants your input on the training program. Hannah touched the frame once, thinking of Sangin, of the 7 years she'd spent invisible, of the locked door and the moment she'd chosen to save a life instead of protect her own existence. She turned to Morrison with the faint smile of someone who'd finally stopped hiding. "Power is not a title," she said. Her voice was different now, deeper, steadier, carrying the weight of someone who'd already stood before better men and watched them fall. "Power is the ability to help." The overnight shift began. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song. And Major Hannah Clarke walked into the work she was always meant to do, spine straight, hand steady, finally visible. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, you understand why this story matters. Like, subscribe, and comment. Tell us about the moment someone finally saw who you really were. You won't believe what happens next.